Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is LaCerda, Director of Economic Research at Moody's Analytics. Brendan, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Today marks less than a week from President Trump's Liberation Day, where he unveiled his sweeping tariff policy. And since that day, just a few days ago, trillions of dollars have been wiped away from the global economy. On Tuesday morning, we've seen U.S. markets start to make a bit of a comeback. So can you talk to us first, to start off the conversation, about how you view the moment we're in right now?
We are in a climactic moment right now, and I don't think that understates it. You have to imagine, for 50 years, the United States has promoted a system of trade liberalization, free trade agreements. So, ever since the 1970s, billions of dollars has been flowing across the globe, building factories, constructing supply chains. And these tariffs completely upend the revenue, cost, profit calculus of all these investments. And quite simply, if the administration is trying to undo 50 years of trade policy in a matter of days and weeks and months, and so it's not surprising that the market has had this very negative reaction to this really tumultuous change.
That's really interesting. 50 years of status quo completely upended in a matter of days. And the Council of Economic Advisors chair was asked if the tariffs plan is simply a negotiation or the new rules of the game. And he said either. Does that concern you, that it seems like the White House doesn't really have a plan? Because that's not really an either or question. You can't have both. It's either negotiations or it's, the new rules of the road. What do you make of that answer?
This is why we're seeing these gyrations in the market, because we're not getting a consistent, clear message coming out of the White House. Some advisors are saying, this is the new law of the land. These tariffs are staying in place. Other advisors are coming out and saying, no, we want to negotiate deals with countries. You have other advisors coming out and saying, we want to eliminate trade deficits. All of these objectives are at odds with one another. And, it's on, the administration can't simultaneously say, we're going to try to negotiate with certain countries. And then on the other hand, we just saw, I guess a few moments ago, the president has increased his threat against China. And, we see stock prices tanking again. Without a clear message, without a clear plan that businesses can use to guide their investment decisions, the problem is going to be that everyone's going to want to rush to the sidelines and hold on to their cash. And that's a recipe for, stock prices selling off.
What do you make of the chance of a recession? Because Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's, said that the chance of a recession is now at 60%. And the only way it's avoidable if President Trump has an off-ramp when it comes to these tariffs. And that's a term that's really been thrown around the past couple of days, an off-ramp. So A, what does an off-ramp look like? And B, does it look like President Trump is willing to take it?
The odds of recession have increased dramatically over the last 2 months, I would say. I would reframe the question. I get asked a lot, what are the odds of a recession in the next year? I would frame it this way. If Trump keeps going down this path, maintains these tariffs, possibly raises them even further, that is a recipe for recession. If he backs off of this plan, de-escalates, negotiates new deals, our baseline outlook is that the economy slows, but recession is avoidable. So instead of saying what are the odds of a recession, it's really a question of what are the odds that President Trump is going to stick with this strategy, which then gets to the question you raised: is it conceivable that he finds an off ramp and takes that? Our view is yes. I think despite the president's reticence, that this market turmoil, and as it starts to show up too in, jobless claims, and it starts to filter out into, all the other economic data, I think there will be some second guessing of this strategy, and they will find a way to declare victory really without changing the ultimate, rules and the policies.
So are you saying, do you think he will eventually listen to the market? And then once he listens to the markets, how does he declare victory here? I mean, what does that off-ramp look like?
Yeah, I think we can. I think it's a lot of that a lot of that outlook is based on how things evolved back in 2008, 2009. So I guess our outlook is a little bit of history repeats itself. And if we think about that episode, what happened? Trump ramped up the tariffs. It started to cause economic damage. He also started to, deploy stimulus to help out farmers and manufacturers and offset that damage. Of course, we never really knew what happened in the end because COVID-19 came along and the pandemic and whatnot. But the economy was definitely starting to weaken at that point. And sort of thinking that history repeats itself again, I think he finds that off-ramp. Now, your question about what does that off-ramp look like? I think it, by and large, is mostly a face-saving deal. It's something that, he can wave in front of the cameras and say, declare victory, but ultimately it doesn't really change the rules of trade that much. So, yeah, a lot of emerging countries that, tend to have higher tariffs on the United States, maybe they pull back those tariffs slightly. But as I say, we're really not changing. We're sort of really just going back to the way things were before.
We're seeing the markets not like tariffs. We're seeing economists not like tariffs. We're seeing most world leaders certainly not like this tariff plan. But this is what President Trump said when asked about the market reaction to his plan. Quote, "I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something." What are the impacts here? Who do you think broadly are the winners and losers of President Trump's really sweeping tariff initiative?
You started your comment by mentioning Trump's argument that these tariffs are a necessary form of tough medicine. And I really don't see why that's the case. It's not clear that there was anything wrong with the economy. Recessions are never a good thing. There are reasons sometimes that they have to take place. The most obvious example being the 1980 and 1982 Volcker recession, where inflation was raging 10, 12%, and they needed to induce a recession in order to control inflation. That is not the situation we're in right now. Heading into the tariff war, inflation was very nearly back to 2%. Unemployment was remarkably low, 4%. It's not exactly clear what this tariff policy is intended to remedy. And so then we get to the question of, okay, so the policy's going into place, who exactly does it benefit? Tariffs only entail a very narrow benefit to the specific industry being protected. So if you take the case of, aluminum tariffs, if you're involved in primary aluminum manufacturing in the United States, the tariff's probably helpful to you. But for every single person downstream of that who uses aluminum to make bottles and cans or cars or aircraft engines, all of those people downstream are going to suffer. So it's a very narrow sliver of who gets protected. It helps them, but it's always going to entail a much larger group of people that are hurt by the tariffs.
To your point, you usually take medicine to fix something. If, to your point, there's nothing to fix in the economy and this was just one person kind of pulling the trigger here, it's like almost a self-inflicted wound, if that's what you're saying, send the economy into a tailspin. Do you think then that, let's say there is this off-ramp, let's say President Trump does declare victory, the economy will course correct rather quickly?
I think it could course correct rather quickly. And to the point that, I'll say again, there aren't no benefits. If you wanted to find a silver lining in this whole tariff ordeal, I think the one thing would be government revenues. Let's not forget, again, going into this fiscal year, the Congress is running about a $2 trillion per year shortfall. So I would say that the federal government is in desperate need of revenue. However, tariffs are really not the best way about going about getting that revenue. primarily because it represents a regressive sales tax on lower income Americans.
I think that in my conversations with economists, there seems to be this disconnect between what President Trump, what the White House is doing, the messaging behind these tariffs, and then economists saying, hey, this really isn't working, this doesn't really make sense. What do you think then is missing from the national and international dialogue when it comes to President Trump's tariff plan?
In terms of why we don't think President Trump's plan is going to be effective is because of this stroke of the pen risk, that suddenly the policy could change overnight. President Trump, has this focus on reshoring domestic production. So let's look at recent history and ask ourselves, do we have an example where we've seen, a significant increase in U.S. manufacturing investment? And the answer is yes. Under the Biden administration, under the CHIPS Act and the IRA Act, we saw that those policies spurred a significant increase in manufacturing investment in the United States. And the reason was that the policy was legislated, it was written down, it was clear for everyone to understand, there was money behind it, there was subsidies, there was incentives to bring your factory to the United States. So, rather than using the sort of the stick of, beating countries and kind of trying to coerce them into moving their factories back to the United States, we can see from recent history a much more positive example where the previous administration was able to boost manufacturing in the United States. And I think that's one of the big problems here, is that none of these policies are set in stone by legislation. And if that's not there, businesses don't have the confidence to invest, redirect billions of dollars investment, from one country to another.
You started off this conversation by saying we're in a really climatic moment right now. And I know that we've seen trillions of dollars wiped out. The markets today rallying just a bit on Tuesday morning. What specifically are you looking out for next?
I'm actually keeping a really close eye on the bond market too, the 10-year yield. Given the declines in equities, I think we would have expected a larger decline on yields. So it suggests that we don't really have the typical dynamic of, people are, flocking or running away from equities because of fear, and they're flocking to the safety of bonds. It seems that they're not even really doing that to a large extent. That it seems like maybe there's a lot of cash hoarding going on the sidelines. So in terms of what I'm keeping an eye on, definitely longer dated bond yields and also foreign exchange rates, to see are investors seeing a particular risk associated with certain countries because of these policies.
There's a lot of fear and uncertainty right now. Do you think that's overblown, or do you think that's warranted?
That's a tough question. I don't think it's improper for people to be overreacting. As we were talking about in this conversation, this is a dramatic change in policy. I've run the numbers recently. This is going to be one of the largest tax hikes in U.S. history. If you take Trump's reciprocal tariff announcement from April 2nd and you run the numbers, it works out to about a 20% tax on all imports. And run the numbers, if imports are 15% of GDP, that means we all just got like a 3% pay cut. So, I understand that people are reacting the way they are when they just got that news. Now, it's going to be hard to say, where the market finds a bottom here, because I think it depends on, sort of this stream of announcements that's going to keep happening over, successive, weeks and likely months. I mean, we really, our baseline view is that, this tariff turmoil is likely to endure for quite a bit of time.
You had me stumped when you said 3% pay cut. No one wants to hear that right now, especially with summer coming up. Do you think that, let's say we have this conversation about tariffs in a week, in a month, maybe in 2 months, that'll still be the same tune, that people will still be seeing that 3% pay cut?
I think households are smart. You can adapt your household budget to say, let's hold off on buying that new car. hold off on some other, discretionary purchases and things of that sort. But you can't hold off on that payment forever. Eventually, your car breaks down, or you need to put like a new roof on your house or things of that sort. So I think consumers are going to try to, sort of temporarily pull back on their spending to avoid the tariffs. But, assuming the tariffs remain in place, eventually those are going to catch up with them, and there's no avoiding it.
Brett and LaCerda, I really appreciate your insight here. I appreciate the conversation today. Thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.